She laughed at his proposal hours later. She learned the man she mocked owned everything. The late afternoon sun slanted through the glass walls of Steel Enterprises, flooding the vast office with a golden light that shimmered against polished marble and mahogany. The space felt less like a workplace and more like a monument to power high. Ceilings, spotless floors, and the soft hum of the city sprawling far below. Every detail whispered of wealth and authority, from the towering bookcases lined with leather-bound volumes to the abstract paintings that decorated the walls. Ethan Carter stood just inside the doorway, his modest figure framed by the glow of the sun. He wore a pressed white shirt, the collar stiff but not expensive, and dark trousers that had been ironed with care. His shoes gleamed faintly, though anyone could tell they had seen years of wear. A modest tie, carefully knotted, completed the look of a man who had thought deeply about this moment, not to impress with extravagance, but to show respect. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat louder than the last, as though trying to break free from his ribs. His palms, despite the cool air conditioning that filled the office, grew damp with sweat. He clenched them gently at his sides, willing his nerves to quiet. Steady now, he told himself. This isn't about fear, it's about honesty. Victoria Steele sat behind a massive mahogany desk, her presence dominating the room than the furniture ever could. She was elegance woven with steel, a navy blazer cut to perfection, pearl, earrings catching the sunlight, and sharp brown eyes that missed nothing. Her posture was impeccable, her chin tilted just slightly upward, as though she viewed the world and everyone in it from a higher plane. Her gaze lingered on Ethan, studying him with the faintest curl of amusement at the corner of her lips. She had seen men walk through this office carrying portfolios worth millions, their suits stitched in Italy, their wrists adorned with gold and platinum. But here stood Ethan, calm, steady, and entirely unadorned by wealth. His quiet dignity contrasted so sharply with the opulence of her office that it almost unsettled her. Double quotes, Mr. Carter, she said smoothly, her voice like silk wrapped around steel. I wasn't expecting you this afternoon. The sound of her voice pulled him from his thoughts, but not from his nerves. His throat tightened, though he swallowed and stepped forward, each movement deliberate. He had rehearsed this walk in his head countless times, counted the steps, imagined the look on her face, prayed that the words he carried wouldn't stumble on their way out. Victoria, he said, his tone respectful yet filled with a quiet warmth. Thank you for seeing me. She leaned back in her chair, crossing one elegant leg over the other. The golden sunlight caught the glint of her wristwatch, an expensive timepiece that could have bought a small car. Her sharp eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in curiosity, as if wondering what game this man intended to play. Ethan stopped a few feet from her desk, his hand brushing against the inside of his pocket where a small velvet box rested. The cool edge of the box pressed against his fingertips, grounding him in the reality of this moment. His pulse thundered louder. For weeks he had prepared himself, ironed his clothes, rehearsed his words, steadied his courage. And yet, standing here beneath the piercing gaze of Victoria Steele, he felt stripped bare, every flaw exposed. She tilted her head, watching the way his jaw tightened ever so slightly, the way a single bead of sweat trailed from his temple down to his cheek. To her, it was entertaining, an ordinary man in an extraordinary place, standing with a confidence that seemed almost out of place. The silence stretched, filled only by the distant hum of traffic and the ticking of her clock. Ethan took a deep breath, steadying himself. His chest rose and fell, his voice trembling at first but finding its strength as he spoke. Victoria, he began softly, I've come here not for business, but for something more personal. I've thought long and hard about this moment, about what it means and about you. And I need to tell you what rests in my heart. Her eyes sharpened, narrowing in mild amusement. The faintest laugh played at the edges of her mouth, as though she already knew where this was heading and found it amusing rather than moving. She had seen gestures of admiration before, even proposals dressed in extravagance. But this man with his plain clothes and trembling hands was an entirely different kind of spectacle. Ethan's hand brushed the velvet box again, his heart hammering as though it would burst. The afternoon light wrapped around him like a spotlight, illuminating every bead of sweat, every flicker of vulnerability, every ounce of sincerity etched across his face. And for the first time in years, Victoria Steele leaned back in her chair and allowed herself to be entertained not by wealth, not by power, but by the quiet audacity of a man who dared to bare his soul in the heart of her empire. The office had grown so quiet that Ethan could hear the faint ticking of Victoria's clock echoing against the glass walls. His fingers curled around the velvet box, the edges pressing into his palm like a reminder that this was real, that there was no turning back. He drew in a deep breath, steadying his nerves, and stepped closer to her desk. Victoria's sharp eyes followed his every movement, her curiosity barely masking the smug amusement tugging at her lips. Ethan swallowed hard, then dropped to one knee. The motion felt heavy, as though gravity itself had doubled. His chest rose and fell with trembling breaths as he pulled the box from his pocket and opened it with care. Inside was a simple gold ring. No diamonds, no extravagant setting, just polished gold, shining with the weight of meaning rather than wealth. It wasn't the kind of ring that could buy admiration. It was the kind that carried sincerity, forged in sacrifice and intention. Victoria, Ethan said, his voice low but steady. I know we come from different worlds. I know your life is surrounded by wealth and influence, while mine has been built with simpler things. But my heart. He paused, swallowing the lump rising in his throat. My heart has been yours from the moment I met you. I came here today not to impress you with riches, but to ask you to share your life with me. Will you marry me? For a moment, silence blanketed the room. The golden sunlight washed over them both, illuminating Ethan's face, earnest, vulnerable, yet anchored in dignity. His words hung in the air, fragile but profound. Victoria blinked once. Then, as though a dam had burst, laughter spilled from her lips. At first it was a sharp chuckle, then it grew louder and louder, until the sound bounced against the tall glass windows like cruel bells. She leaned back in her chair, one hand pressed against her chest, shaking her head as though she'd just heard the most ridiculous joke of her career. A man like you, she said between peals of laughter, her voice dripping with disbelief, thinks he can propose to me? The words cracked through the air like a whip. Ethan felt the sting immediately. His chest tightened, his heart thudded painfully, and the smile he had tried to hold faltered. But he didn't move. He stayed on one knee, steady and composed, even as humiliation burned through him like fire. The sound of movement outside the office drew his attention for a brief moment. Several of Victoria's colleagues, executives who had been walking by, had stopped near the doorway, drawn by her laughter. Two whispered to each other, smirking behind their hands. Another raised his brows, shaking his head as though the scene unfolding before him was pure entertainment. Victoria noticed their presence too. Instead of quieting her reaction, she leaned into it, as though their audience made the performance sweeter. She waved a dismissive hand toward Ethan. Look at this, she said loudly, ensuring her colleagues heard every word. He comes into my office wearing a shirt that probably cost less than my pen, and thinks he's worthy of proposing to me. This is beyond audacious. It's pathetic. The executives chuckled quietly, their eyes darting between her and Ethan like spectators at a cruel spectacle. The sound of their amusement pierced Ethan's chest more deeply than any blade could. But even as his insides twisted, Ethan did not flinch. He did not rise angrily or hurl insults. He stayed still, his dark eyes meeting hers with a calm strength that startled even those watching. There was pain in his gaze, Yes, raw and unhidden, but beneath it ran a current of unshakable dignity. I knew my words might sound small compared to the world you live in, Ethan said softly, his voice carrying despite the mocking laughter. But what I offered was real. My love isn't dressed in diamonds or luxury, it's dressed in truth. Victoria's laughter faltered for just a second, though she quickly masked it with another sharp scoff. Truth won't buy me a penthouse in Paris, she snapped. Truth won't keep me in the life I've built. I don't need truth, Ethan. I need power. I need wealth. And clearly, you have neither. The executive's smirks widened. One leaned toward another, muttering something that made them both chuckle under their breath. The humiliation pressed in tighter around Ethan, suffocating, like chains pulling at his chest. His knuckles whitened around the small box, yet he refused to let his composure shatter. Slowly, he closed the ring box with care, as though preserving not just the ring, but the dignity of the moment itself. He rose to his feet, his movements deliberate, graceful, almost regal despite the mockery filling the room. Victoria tilted her chin higher, her smile triumphant, as if she had won some silent battle of superiority. But the look in Ethan's eyes told a different story, though his heart stung with the cruel rejection. Though whispers of humiliation danced around him, he did not bow. His posture remained tall, his gaze unbroken. He had given his heart with sincerity, and though it was mocked, he refused to let arrogance strip him of his strength. In that moment, the audience felt the divide crystal clear. Victoria, with her hollow laughter echoing in wealth-stained walls, and Ethan, with his quiet strength that refused to crumble. And for the first time, those watching weren't entirely certain who, between the two, truly held the power. The laughter in the room lingered like smoke, acrid and heavy. Ethan stood there, ring box now quietly tucked into his pocket, his expression calm yet unreadable. To the onlookers, it seemed as though the humiliation should have shattered him. Yet something in his presence, steady, almost regal, suggested otherwise. Victoria, still basking in her triumph, leaned back in her chair and crossed her arms. Her eyes glittered with arrogance as she said, "You should learn your place, Ethan. A man like you should never dream of reaching for someone like me." But her words, sharp as they were, seemed to slip past him like arrows bouncing off armor. Instead of shrinking beneath them, Ethan spoke softly, his voice carrying a weight that silenced the chuckles around the room. "Everyone's place," he said, "isn't defined by what others see on the surface. Sometimes what you overlook is what carries the most worth." There was something about the way he said it, measured, assured, as though accustomed to speaking to people who listened carefully to his words. His tone was not of a man pleading for recognition, but of one who already possessed it in circles. Beyond their imagination, the air shifted. For the first time, Victoria's smirk faltered, almost imperceptibly. One of the executives near the door frowned, his eyes narrowing as if recognition had just sparked. He leaned toward his colleague and whispered, though not quietly enough, "Isn't that the man I saw leaving the Mercer Tower last week, the private investment meeting?" His companion blinked, startled. "Mercer? You mean the one only billionaires and heads of state get invited to?" The words slipped into the air like a dropped stone into still water, sending ripples through the room. Victoria's expression stiffened ever so slightly, though she quickly forced a laugh. "Nonsense," she said, waving a dismissive hand. "He probably wandered in by mistake. Men like him don't belong in places like Mercer Tower." But Ethan's silence in response was telling. He didn't deny it. He didn't defend himself. He simply stood tall, the faintest curve of a smile tugging at the corner of his lips, as though their words amused him more than they wounded him. As Victoria turned to shuffle her papers, Ethan adjusted the cuff of his sleeve. The subtle movement revealed a glimmer of polished metal, a watch, sleek and understated, yet instantly recognizable to the more observant eye. Not the kind bought in glass counters at luxury malls, but the kind reserved for collectors, Custom-made and worth more than most cars parked in the CEO's garage. One executive noticed, his eyes widening as he whispered, "That's a Vacheron. Constantin, that piece costs at least $500,000. Another leaned closer, suddenly curious. Why would he be wearing that? Victoria caught the whispers, her irritation rising. She had mocked Ethan with certainty, assuming she knew every detail of his life, simply by his clothes and the simplicity of his proposal. Yet now, faint threads of doubt tugged at her confidence. Ethan finally broke the silence, his voice calm, carrying with it an air of authority that seemed to command the room without effort. "You see wealth as something displayed," he said, glancing briefly toward Victoria. "But true wealth doesn't shout. It doesn't need to. It speaks quietly, through wisdom, through patience, through the ability to walk away from arrogance without losing grace." His words carried more than philosophy. They carried experience. He spoke not like a man on the outside looking in, but as someone who had lived in the world of power and money long enough to see through its illusions. Outside the glass wall of Victoria's office, a sleek black car idled by the curb, polished so perfectly it caught the sun like a mirror. The driver, a man in a sharp suit with an earpiece discreetly in place, stood at the ready, occasionally glancing up toward the office, as though awaiting his passenger. One of the executives, unable to suppress his curiosity, muttered, "That's not just any car. That's a Maybach, custom-plated." The whispers grew louder, threading uncertainty into the room. The smirks faded, replaced by furrowed brows and nervous glances. The atmosphere shifted from mockery to suspense. Who was Ethan really? Victoria forced another laugh, brittle this time, the edges cracking. "You all are being ridiculous," she snapped. "Do you really think he could be anything more than what he looks like? Just a man with nothing to offer?" But even as she spoke, her voice betrayed a faint tremor. Her eyes flicked toward his watch, then the silhouette of the waiting car below. Doubt had taken root. Ethan did not correct her. He did not confirm or deny. He simply let the mystery build around him, his quiet confidence more revealing than any boast could ever be. He slipped the ring box fully into his pocket, adjusted his jacket, and straightened his posture. The executive shifted uncomfortably, caught between their loyalty to Victoria and the undeniable clues forming before their eyes. And then Ethan spoke again, his tone so measured, so assured, it left an echo in the room. "The greatest mistake people make," he said, "is confusing simplicity with insignificance. Not everything valuable comes wrapped in glitter. Sometimes what you dismiss today is what you'll wish for tomorrow." The silence that followed was deafening. The earlier laughter had evaporated, replaced by a charged stillness that left even Victoria struggling to find her footing. For the first time, it was not Ethan who seemed small in the room. It was Victoria. And though no one dared to say it out loud, every person present felt the same rising question ripple through their thoughts. Who exactly is this man? The whispers that had begun in Victoria's office earlier in the afternoon refused to die. They trailed behind Ethan like a shadow as he left the room, his steps unhurried, his posture straight, as though the humiliation hadn't touched him. Victoria had laughed at him, but there was something about the way he carried himself that unsettled her. She buried her doubts under a veil of arrogance, convincing herself it was all coincidence. But as the day stretched on, fate arranged a stage no one could have predicted. That evening, the company's boardroom buzzed with anticipation. A high-profile meeting was set, one that would determine the future of Victoria's firm. She sat at the head of the long mahogany table, tall, windows behind her glowing with the fading orange light of dusk. The city skyline shimmered, but Victoria's thoughts were restless. Today, a new investor was rumored to reveal himself, someone powerful enough to shift the balance of ownership within the company. The board members chatted nervously, straightening their suits, whispering about possibilities. A foreign tycoon, A hedge fund titan. Perhaps an old money dynasty family. Victoria smirked, feeling secure. Whoever it was, she would win them over. She always did. The doors to the boardroom opened, and in stepped Ethan. The room fell silent. Conversations froze mid-sentence. Chairs creaked as heads turned in disbelief. Victoria's smile cracked, her face draining of color. The man she had mocked mere hours ago, the man she had humiliated in front of her colleagues, was now walking toward the head of the table with the confidence of someone who belonged there. He was no visitor this time. He was announced by the chairman himself. "Ladies and gentlemen," the chairman said, rising with visible respect in his tone, "allow me to introduce Mr. Ethan Carter, the company's newest majority shareholder and silent partner who has supported us through the last 3 quarters. Effective today, he holds controlling interest." The words hit the room like a thunderclap. Murmurs erupted, some stunned, some reverent. The executives who had laughed earlier that afternoon shifted uneasily, suddenly remembering every smirk, every whisper. Victoria sat frozen, her mind scrambling to make sense of it. This couldn't be possible. Ethan, the man she'd mocked, the man she dismissed as unworthy, was now the one who controlled her fate. Ethan took his seat, not beside her, but at the opposite end of the table, where power naturally gravitated. He didn't slam his authority on the table, didn't revel in her shock. Instead, he placed his hands calmly before him, his expression dignified yet serene. "I realize," Ethan began, his voice steady and warm, "that today has been full of assumptions." His eyes briefly flickered toward Victoria, though without hostility. When people see someone dressed simply, they often assume simplicity of mind or spirit as well. When they see humility, they mistake it for weakness. He paused, letting his words settle into the room, each syllable charged with quiet power. But humility isn't weakness. It's strength under control, and wealth, true wealth, doesn't need to announce itself. Victoria's throat tightened. Her colleagues avoided her eyes, but their silence was its own judgment. Ethan leaned back slightly, his gaze calm yet piercing. "This afternoon, I made a proposal, not to flaunt money, not to prove power, but because I believed sincerity should still matter in a world where appearances often outweigh truth." His voice softened, but the strength behind it did not waver. "I didn't propose to impress anyone. I proposed because I value honesty above all else." The room remained hushed, every person riveted by his words. There was no arrogance in his tone, no desire to humiliate. If anything, his grace only deepened the sting of Victoria's earlier cruelty. He wasn't rising the mocker, he was rising. Above her, one of the older board members cleared his throat, clearly moved. "Mr. Carter, your presence here, it's an honor. Your investments have already stabilized this company. With your leadership, we have no doubt the future is secure." The others nodded in agreement, their loyalty shifting toward Ethan in real time. In their eyes, he wasn't merely a man with wealth. He was a leader with vision, dignity, and restraint. Victoria's hands trembled beneath the table. The memory of her own laughter, sharp and cruel, now echoed back at her like a curse. She wanted to protest, to explain, to apologize, but no words formed. All she could do was sit in silence as the power she had so long wielded slipped from her, grasp into Ethan's calm hands. Ethan's final words cut through the stillness like a blade cloaked in silk. "Money can build walls or bridges. It can be used to control or to uplift. I have no interest in belittling anyone. But I will never forget how people reveal their hearts when they believe someone has nothing to offer them." The room remained silent, yet the lesson hung heavy in the air. It was not just a business revelation. It was a moral reckoning. Victoria lowered her gaze, the weight of her arrogance pressing down on her like chains. And in that moment, the balance of power was undeniable. The man she mocked had become the man who defined her future. And Ethan, with the dignity of a true leader, chose grace over vengeance. The boardroom eventually dispersed, the heavy tension dissolving into hushed whispers and careful glances toward Ethan. Papers were gathered, chairs slid back into place, but the echo of his words lingered like a song no one could forget. Victoria remained seated long after the others had gone. Her posture collapsed into the leather chair that had once made her feel invincible. The glow of the city lights outside no longer seemed like a symbol of her power, but a reflection of the illusion she had lived under. For the first time in years, she was stripped of her armor, the arrogance, the sharp tongue, the self-assured dominance that had carried her through countless battles. None of it could shield her from the truth she had seen in Ethan's eyes. Ethan didn't linger in the boardroom. He rose with the same quiet dignity he had carried from the start, offering polite nods to those who now looked at him with reverence. But he did not bask in their awe. He did not savor the reversal of fortune or seek to revel in Victoria's shame. That was never his aim. When he reached the door, he paused. His voice, calm and steady, broke the silence Victoria had wrapped herself in. Power and wealth, he said softly, not turning to face her, are fleeting if they are not rooted in character. You thought me less because of what I seemed. But true worth isn't measured by the eye, it's revealed by how we treat others, especially when we think they have nothing to offer. His words sank deep, cutting sharper than mockery ever could. Because they carried no malice, only truth. Victoria's throat tightened. She wanted to speak, to apologize, but her voice betrayed her, trembling with the weight of shame. All she could do was lower her gaze, blinking against the sting of tears. She had not expected. Ethan did not wait for her response. He simply walked out, his footsteps measured, steady, leaving behind an emptiness that was more powerful than anger. The evening sun had begun its descent, painting the city streets in strokes of amber and gold. As Ethan stepped outside the towering glass building, the warm light caught him, bathing his silhouette in radiance. He walked calmly, unbothered by the stares of onlookers who now recognized him, whispers fluttering through the crowd like restless birds. But Ethan paid them no mind. He had never needed their validation. His heart was steady, his spirit unshaken. What mattered most was not the empire he could command, but the integrity that guided his steps. Behind him, high above in her corner office, Victoria stood at the window, watching him leave. For once, her gaze was not calculating or proud. It was searching, haunted by the realization of how blind she had been. She thought of her laughter, sharp and cruel, and how small it now seemed compared to the enormity of his grace. Her reflection in the glass no longer looked like a conqueror, but a student humbled by the harshest lesson of all, that judgment born of arrogance blinds you as to the truth of others. Ethan reached the edge of the street where his car waited. The driver, a man who had served him loyally for years, opened the door. Yet Ethan paused, letting the golden light wash over him for one quiet moment. It was a reminder of how far he had come, not from poverty to wealth, but from invisibility to recognition. Not because of the billions he possessed, but because he had remained steadfast in his values, even when the world mocked him. And in that pause, the lesson crystallized out to those who would hear his story. It was not just about a man who revealed himself to be a billionaire. It was about the strength of humility, the dignity of patience, and the truth that no one should ever be measured by surface appearances, for appearances fade. Status crumbles, wealth shifts from hand to hand, but character endures. Victoria, still staring from her high window, felt the weight of that truth more heavily than any boardroom defeat. She whispered to herself, almost as if confessing to the fading sun, I judged the surface, and I missed the soul. Ethan, stepping into his car, didn't look back. He didn't need to. His message was already etched in the hearts of those who had witnessed it. As the vehicle pulled away, the last rays of the sun caught the city in a warm embrace, as though sealing the moment with light. And so the story closed not with triumph or vengeance, but with a truth too powerful to ignore. Never underestimate a person because of how they look, where they come from, or what you think they lack. True greatness is not measured in wealth or power, but in humility, perseverance, and the integrity to stand tall even when the world seeks to diminish you. Ethan understood this. And now so did Victoria.